the 28th of July, 1794, one of the most powerful French politicians was taken to his execution at the guillotine inside of Paris. He was executed in the same place as the King and Queen of France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, but Robespierre was someone who inside of the nation may have been more hated by the end of his life than the monarchy. He was the president of the National Convention and also the head of the Committee of Public Safety that instigated a reign of terror inside of the nation. During this period of time, there were roughly 17,000 executions across the nation, as there was a huge sense of fear about those who supported the monarchy. Anyone who had any feeling of support for the executed king or queen would be dragged in front of a trial and then beheaded on the guillotine. But Robespierre flew too close to the sun himself, and he then lost his head. But in the years after his execution, there were a number of alleged death masks made of the former beast. But what is the history behind these? It was throughout the reign of terror that Robespierre rose to prominence, and he encountered a large number of enemies who regarded him as very dangerous. He intensified the reign of terror in the aftermath of the king's execution, and many people were wrongly executed at this time, and the guillotine blade kept falling inside of towns and cities. He was someone who had little regard for the lives of the people, but he wanted the strictest punishments for those people who were said to have dishonoured or disobeyed the revolution. Inside of France there was a lot of fear, and people believed that the executions had gone too far, but he would later be deposed by his rivals. He was forced in front of the National Convention, and he spoke at length about his enemies, and he defended himself that he was not a dictator or was not guilty of tyranny. However, he was then arrested. People inside of the convention believed that if they did not deal with Robespierre, then they would be in danger themselves, and the convention had, in 13 months, at the hands of Robespierre, lost 144 members, with 67 of these being executed, and the others either deciding to take their own lives because of the fear, or they died inside of prisons. Everyone was against Robespierre, and he was then arrested, but his arrest did not go without suffering, and there are different stories as to what happened. Some claimed that he tried to shoot himself in the mouth, and others claimed that he was shot by someone else. However, Robespierre suffered a significant injury to the lower part of his jaw, which had practically been blown apart. Robespierre spent the rest of the evening in the antechamber at the Committee of General Security, recovering, and he laid his head on a pine box, and he was covered in blood. Later in the morning, a military doctor arrived and removed parts of his shattered jaw, and also took out some of his teeth, and Robespierre was then locked up inside of a cell in the Conciergerie prison, and on the 28th of July 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal gathered, and within 2 hours he was sentenced to death. That evening at 6 p.m, Robespierre and a number of others who were his allies were taken from their cells to the Place de la Révolution for their executions. The men were taken in 3 carts, as there were so many of them, and Robespierre was in the 10th in that series of executions that were to take place. He was helped up the execution scaffold and came face to face with Charles Henry Sanson, the man who had executed the king. And Sanson took away his bandage around his mouth, and this led Robespierre to scream due to the pain. He was going to his execution with panic and pain, and Sanson then placed him under the guillotine and quickly released the blade. This fell onto the neck cleanly of Robespierre, and the crowd then erupted into happiness and applause as his head was taken off, and for 15 minutes the crowd went wild. After this, the remains of Robespierre were gathered up in a coffin and were taken to the Erences Cemetery, a new burial ground, as there were so many executions during the Terror. He was thrown inside of a grave, but was later dug up and moved to the catacombs of Paris. However, there have been a number of death masks of Robespierre that have emerged over the years. It was known that at this time Madame Tussaud was ordered by revolutionaries to take death masks and imprints of prominent people who were executed by the guillotine, and it is believed that this was the case with Robespierre. She cast the head of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and from these models of the heads were taken. She did this usually straight after the blade had fallen, and did this under duress. Madame Tussaud either performed this inside of cemeteries or at the foot of the guillotine. However, the death mask of Robespierre is a little bit more mysterious. It was not easy to cast a death mask either, especially under difficult conditions. Imagine Madame Tussaud working at the foot of the guillotine, doing this whilst the crowd of thousands jeered. It was said of the method of casting the mask that, in order to create a death mask, there was a specific process. First, the deceased's hair and eyebrows were covered with clay or oil so the plaster would not stick to it. Next, plaster was ladled over the head of the individual. Sometimes this meant propping them up into a sitting position, as seen in the picture, or carefully doing it lying down. Next, a thread was placed from the bottom of the chin to the top of the forehead, in this the thinner plaster. Fourth, thicker plaster was added, and the string was removed to create a mask in two halves for easier removal. Once hard, the mould was removed and then placed back together. Before a mask could be made, the plaster cast was cleaned and then filled with modelling clay or new plaster to make the mask. But some of the death masks that have emerged of Robespierre are rather shocking and gruesome, but some also show the face of Robespierre missing a number of interesting things. First of all, the jaw of Robespierre in the rumoured Madame Tussaud's mask is in one piece and does not have an injury like we know that he had. We know that he was, when taken under the guillotine, that he was screaming and in a huge amount of pain, and by all accounts he was a mess. However, Madame Tussaud's own memoirs claim that she took a cast of the mutilated head of Robespierre and that she had met him previously. There has been a belief that emerged that a death mask did not get cast of Robespierre due to the need to bury him and dispose of his body quickly, as there was a worry that people would try to dig him up or even take relics from his corpse. This was documented, and it was said that a series of measures is thus taken in the immediacy of events. The final disappearance of the corpses of Robespierrists must be hastened, the incorruptible corrupted. Decomposition of the bodies is accelerated, the communal ditch of the Erances closely guarded, as well as the Rue de Rocha, which leads to it, to avoid any theft of relics, and a death mask is prohibited. Setting this apart from other famous victims of the guillotine, executions in the course of which the executioners were less scrupulous. With this it would cast doubt into whether Madame Tussaud was allowed to cast a death mask, as this would be a prominent reminder of Robespierre, and the authorities did not want this. They wanted his remains dealing with straight away, and probably added quicklime into his grave to speed up the decomposition process, as they did with King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Robespierre was one of the most notorious figures in French history, and he had the blood of thousands of people on his hands. Under his leadership, he acted almost as a dictator, and he put many people to the sword during the Terror. This was a period of great fear, as if a wife wept as she witnessed her husband's head being taken off, then she too was likely to be dragged to the guillotine, as her tears were interpreted as anti-revolutionary. Like many in history, Robespierre was turned upon, and he too was condemned and executed. But his death mask may have gone missing, if one was ever cast at all. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe. Thank you.